Somewhere outside Hefei, construction crews are pouring concrete for a memory fab that, if the announced numbers hold, would add more clean room floor space in 2 years than Samsung's entire new node expansion program. The firm behind it is Changxin Memory Technologies, a single Hefei-based DRAM maker whose entire public existence spans less than a decade. Why would the world's youngest major memory maker sink capital into 5 times Samsung's new wafer capacity at the exact moment in the cycle when memory firms go bankrupt? Changxin Memory Technologies, or CXMT, is the case. The most sophisticated memory architectures are the door the incumbents guarded most carefully, padlocked with export rules, patent stacks, and exclusive supply agreements. A lock that elaborate tells you exactly what is behind it. CXMT read the door and decided to cut a key. So, why pour capital into 5 times Samsung's new wafer capacity at the top of the most dangerous cycle in memory history? The obvious answer is that artificial intelligence infrastructure has created a memory shortage so severe that almost any new capacity looks justified. Hyperscalers are spending at rates that make DRAM investment look safe. Multiple analysts flagged undersupply in advanced memory through 2024 and into 2025. High-bandwidth DRAM demand has spiked in ways that were not modeled even 3 years ago. The incentive is visible from orbit. The problem is that this is precisely the reasoning that has destroyed memory companies for 40 years. Elpida built for the peak. Qimonda built for the peak. You pour concrete during the shortage resolves before your fab clears qualification, and you emerge into a glut carrying a balance sheet full of depreciation and half-empty clean rooms. My instinct when I first mapped CXMT's announced numbers against the cycle was to call this reckless, a textbook late-cycle capacity trap. But that instinct assumes CXMT is playing the same game Micron or Elpida played. I do not think it is. The artificial intelligence shortage explains why memory investment is happening at all. It does not explain the scale or the speed. Ask again. So, why pour capital into 5 times Samsung's new wafer capacity at the top of the most dangerous cycle in memory history? The second answer is supply security. Export controls have progressively narrowed the technology China can import for advanced semiconductor manufacturing. Reports suggest Chinese cloud and artificial intelligence firms have been actively seeking domestic memory sources. If controls expand further, and recent years suggest they will, dependence on Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron becomes a structural fragility. CXMT is building a buffer that cannot be switched off by a foreign government's regulatory decision. The state's support for this build-out is consistent with that logic, and it is well documented in public planning materials. This answer is more convincing, but it still does not explain the rush into high-bandwidth memory specifically, or the scale. A domestic supply play is by definition defensive. It does not need to outpace Samsung's expansion rate. It needs to be adequate. And high-bandwidth memory is the one product where SK Hynix and NVIDIA have built a relationship so tight that qualifying a rival stack takes years of co-development. Here is where I push back on my own framing. A pure domestic supply thesis would predict a slow, steady build-out, hidden from price cycles, insulated from the market. What CXMT is doing is the opposite of hidden. The scale is the signal. Supply security explains why CXMT exists and why the state funds it. It does not explain why the bet is this large or this fast. One more pass. So why pour capital into 5 times Samsung's new wafer capacity at the top of the most dangerous cycle in memory history? The real answer is about what 2026 capacity does to the 2027 and 2028 price floor. Memory is structurally oligopolistic. Historically, 3 or 4 firms have set global DRAM supply, and small shifts in their collective output have produced violent price swings, documented across cycle after cycle. In a market where roughly 2% of global supply moving can swing every competitor's margins, being large enough to move supply is being large enough to set the terms. Reports suggest CXMT's announced capacity targets, if achieved, would give it a non-negligible share of global DRAM supply by the late 2020s. No independent confirmation of yield or node parity exists yet, but the stated targets are public. Picture a reservoir feeding a valley. The farms downstream set their planting schedules around how full it is. One new upstream channel adds just enough flow to keep the reservoir stable, even in dry season. Suddenly, every downstream farmer reprices their water risk. CXMT is not trying to flood the valley. It is trying to be the channel that prevents the reservoir from dropping far enough to trigger panic buying among its rivals. The incumbent's margins are the target, not the spot price. And the high bandwidth memory stack is the sealed door. Years of co-development between SK Hynix and NVIDIA, process knowledge that is not written down anywhere public, thermal, and packaging constraints solved through iteration rather than documentation. What CXMT is doing is not kicking that door. It is building a parallel corridor and seeing whether the tenants eventually need two exits. If you stacked the silicon wafers that would come off that announced line annually and laid them edge to edge, you would pave a road from Hefei to Shanghai. That is not a metaphor for ambition. It is a logistics and yield problem of a specific size, with specific power draw, specific ultra-pure water demand, and specific failure modes at every process step. Now, I want to be precise about where my confidence ends. The bullish reading is that CXMT reaches a competitive node on standard DRAM faster than Western analysts have projected, which some reports suggest is already closer than the consensus assumed 2 years ago. At that point, its scale gives it genuine pricing influence in a market where the incumbents are already carrying heavy capital expenditure of their own. The margin compression lands on Samsung and Micron before it lands on CXMT. The bearish reading is that yield at advanced nodes is not a rounding error. It is the entire game. A fab that runs at poor yield on 5 times the wafer starts burns capital faster than it builds revenue. High bandwidth memory stacking adds thermal and fragility constraints that floor space alone does not solve. And NVIDIA has no obvious incentive to qualify a new high bandwidth memory vendor quickly when its existing supply chain is working. The capacity could sit underutilized through the exact window it was built to capture. Both readings agree on the physical plant. They disagree entirely on what comes out of it. The capacity announcements are real. Whether the yield, the node, and the high bandwidth memory stack are competitive, that is where I am working from company claims and analyst estimates, not independent benchmarks. That disagreement cannot be settled from the outside yet. The question framed at the start, why would the world's youngest major memory maker build 5 times Samsung's new wafer capacity at the top of the cycle, assumes CXMT is reacting to the cycle, timing a trade. The evidence points to something different. CXMT is trying to exit the cycle logic entirely by becoming large enough that its own output decisions shape global supply. The better question is this: at what scale does a memory firm stop being a price taker and start being a price setter? And is CXMT building to that number on purpose? If the capacity numbers and node targets are accurate, yes. And that is a different kind of ambition than anything a memory startup has attempted in this industry in 30 years. My read is that this is not a reckless bet, and it is not purely a defensive one. It is a structural play, an attempt to buy into the part of the market where scale confers power over rivals' margins, not just over your own costs. Whether the yield is there to back it up is the only question that matters now, and we do not have the answer yet. Back at the Hefei site, the cranes are not building for the 2025 price spike. They are pouring foundations for a position in the 2027 market structure. That is a long bet on concrete. The incumbents padlocked high-bandwidth memory with co-development agreements, process secrets, and exclusive packaging relationships. Locks that intricate exist because what is behind them is worth protecting. CXMT read the lock and decided the answer was not a better lockpick. It was a bigger door of its own. The question was never whether CXMT could afford to build this fast. The question is whether the incumbents can afford it if CXMT succeeds. If CXMT hits its capacity targets and a competitive node by 2027, which incumbent takes the margin hit first, Samsung, Micron, or SK Hynix? Make the case in the comments. If you want to keep following how this plays out, the yield numbers, the high bandwidth memory qualification timeline, what the next export control move looks like, subscribe and turn on notifications. That is exactly what this channel tracks.